The straw beneath you smells of last autumn, dry and faintly sweet, the way harvested fields smell just before the first frost comes to finish what the season started. You are aware of it before you are aware of anything else. Then the weight arrives. Not pain, not yet. Just weight, the kind that presses down on the chest and the eyes and the backs of the hands and makes the world feel as though it has quietly, without asking, doubled in gravity overnight. You try to move. The body disagrees. And so you lie there in a cottage so small that the walls are close enough to touch from the center, and you understand. The way the body always understands before the mind catches up that something is wrong. It is sometime in the early 14th century. The village around you is already waking. You can hear it through the wattle and daub, the low complaint of a goat being led somewhere it does not wish to go, the clink of a bucket against the stone edge of the well, the voice of someone's daughter calling to someone's son, across a lane no wider than 2 arms stretched wide. The world is proceeding without you. This is the first strange thing about being sick in a medieval village. How loudly ordinary life continues, just beyond the wall, while you lie here in the particular silence of the unwell. While you lie here in the particular silence of the unwell. Go ahead and settle in now. Adjust the pillow behind you, pull whatever is warm a little closer, because this story is going to take you somewhere that very few people think to go. Not the castles, not the kings, but the small and tender world of the ordinary, the forgotten, the human. Your name for tonight is Thomas. You are a villain, a bound tenant on a manor in the county of Lincolnshire. You farm a strip of land that is not yours, in a village of perhaps 40 souls, most of whom share your surname because most of whom share your great-grandfather. You have never seen a physician. You would not know what one looked like. The nearest market town is half a day's walk, and in it there is an apothecary whose remedies cost more than a week's labour. These facts do not frighten you because you have never known anything different. They are simply the shape of the world. The way cold is cold and dark is dark, and a man who cannot work is a problem the family must solve together. Your wife, Eleanor, sees it in your eyes before you have said a word. She has been watching you for 2 days, quietly, the way a careful woman watches the sky before a journey. She sets down the wooden bowl she was carrying, and comes to where you are lying and presses the back of her hand, rough, warm, certain, against your forehead. The touch lasts only a moment, but it is the first kindness in what is about to become a very long day, and somehow it is enough to make everything else slightly more bearable. The rooster outside crows once, indifferently, and moves on. There was no word for diagnosis in the village. There was only the quiet, collective act of recognition. The way a community of people who had lived close to suffering for generations could look at a man lying still on a pallet and begin, without being asked, to remember what they knew. Eleanor did not send for anyone immediately. That was not how it worked. First, she watched. She noted the colour of Thomas's face, not pale exactly, but dull, the way pewter looks when it has not been polished in a long while. She noted that he had not eaten since yesterday's thin pottage. She noted the way he breathed, slightly too carefully, as though breathing had become something that required effort and attention rather than simply happening the way it was supposed to. These observations were not written down anywhere. They lived entirely inside her, catalogued in the wordless language of a woman who had nursed 2 children through fever and buried one. What the village knew was vast and strange and ancient and mostly unwritten. It lived in the mouths of the old, passed from grandmother to granddaughter like a folded piece of cloth handed down through generations, worn at the edges, slightly changed each time, but still essentially itself. There were things you did for a cough, and things you did for a fever, and things you did for a swelling that would not go down, and things you absolutely did not do, under any circumstances, because someone's grandmother's grandmother had done it once, and what followed was not spoken about at the supper table. This knowledge had no single author. It belonged to everyone and to no one. It was the village's oldest inheritance. Eleanor's neighbour, a broad-shouldered woman named Agnes, who smelled always faintly of wood smoke and onions, appeared at the doorway without knocking. No one knocked in a village this size, because privacy was an idea that had not yet arrived in Lincolnshire. She looked at Thomas, she looked at Eleanor. She made the particular sound that older women in small communities make when they have already arrived at a conclusion and are simply deciding how much of it to share. Then she said that her own husband had lain like that 3 winters ago, and that what had helped him was a poultice of mustard and lard applied to the chest before sleeping. Eleanor said she had no mustard. Agnes said she would go and get some. This was how medieval medicine began most of the time. Not with ceremony, not with incantation, with a neighbour walking back across a muddy lane to check her stores. The knowledge Agnes carried was not foolish, even if it looks strange from a distance of 7 centuries. Some of it worked in the quiet and unremarkable way that many folk remedies work, not through magic, yet through the body's own stubborn insistence on healing itself when given warmth and rest, and something that smells strongly enough to make a person believe something is happening. Belief in a world without laboratories was its own kind of medicine, and the village understood this, even if it had no word for the understanding. Thomas lay still and listened to the women talking above him, their voices low and practical and almost soothing, and felt, despite everything, that he was not entirely alone in this. But knowledge, in a world without books, lives only as long as the person who holds it, and the old herbalist at the edge of the village was not as young as she used to be. Her name was Maud, and she had been old for as long as anyone in the village could remember, which meant she had probably been old for 30 years. Because in a village in 14th century Lincolnshire, old began arriving somewhere around 45 and rarely waited for an invitation. She lived in a cottage slightly apart from the others, not because she had chosen solitude exactly, but because the things she kept had a tendency to smell strongly and occasionally to draw insects, and her neighbours had, over the decades, drifted gently but firmly to a respectful distance. Her roof was a particular shape of dishevelled. Her garden was less a garden than an argument between plants that she had largely decided to let the plants win. Eleanor came to Maud's door in the late morning, when the mist had not quite finished lifting from the low fields, and the air still tasted of cold and damp earth. She brought with her a small piece of salted pork wrapped in cloth, payment, or as close to payment as the village economy of exchange and obligation generally came. Maud accepted it without comment, set it on the table beside a bowl of something dark and unidentifiable, and listened to Eleanor Desker I.B. Thomas's symptoms with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had been doing this for longer than Eleanor had been alive. Maud asked 3 questions. She asked what colour the sputum was, if there was sputum. She asked whether the fever rose in the evening or in the morning. She asked whether Thomas had been near any standing water recently, or had eaten anything unusual in the past week. These questions sound almost clinical, almost modern, and that is because the observation of patterns is not a modern invention. Maud had no theory of germ transmission. She had no concept of bacteria, but she had watched people get sick for 50 years, and she had noticed things, the way quiet and attentive people always notice things, and the patterns she had noticed were not entirely wrong. She moved through her cottage with the slow certainty of someone who knows exactly where everything is, even when it appears to everyone else that nothing is anywhere in particular. She reached for a bundle of dried herbs hanging from the low rafter, yarrow, most likely, with something else twisted in beside it, something grey-green and faintly sharp-smelling. She held it briefly under her own nose, as though checking that it still contained whatever she needed it to contain. Then she reached for a second bundle and a third, and she laid them on the rough table and began to work. There was something deeply, quietly moving about watching her, not because what she did was mystical. It was not. It was practical and earthy and smelled aggressively of the hedgerow, but because she was doing everything she knew how to do with everything she had for a man she did not particularly know, in a world that offered her no tools beyond her own accumulated memory. This is what care looked like before institutions existed to hold it. It looked like an old woman's hands moving surely in a small, dark room reaching for what she remembered. She wrapped the dried mixture in a piece of rough linen and pressed it into Eleanor's hands. She spoke quietly about how to prepare it. She said something else, quietly at the door, that Eleanor would not repeat to Thomas, not yet, and her fingers had remembered what her mind had almost forgotten. The poultice went on Thomas's chest that afternoon, wrapped in the same rough linen Maud had used, and the smell of it filled the cottage immediately and completely, sharp and green and slightly bitter, the way the air smells in a forest after heavy rain when the earth is giving something back. Thomas said nothing about the smell, because saying nothing about the smell was the reasonable response of a man who understood that his wife had walked through cold mud to obtain something she believed might help him, and that gratitude in marriage sometimes looks like endurance. Medieval remedies were made of the world. That is the simplest way to say it. They came from fields and hedgerows and the dark places under logs where certain mosses grew, from the kitchens of cottages and the memory of women who had learned from women, who had learned from women, who had learned from women, reaching back so far that the original source had long since dissolved into something older than record. Yarrow for fever. Garlic for infection, though infection was not the word anyone used. They called it corruption of the blood, or bad humour, or sometimes simply the sickness, as though naming it more precisely might invite it to stay. Elderflower for the lungs, honey when there was honey, for almost everything, slathered onto wounds and stirred into warm drinks and pressed against swollen gums with the confident generosity of something that actually, genuinely worked. Some of these remedies, if you set them under the light of modern science, reveal themselves to be quietly remarkable. Yarrow, Achillea millefolium, the plant that legend says Achilles used to staunch his soldiers' wounds, has genuine antimicrobial properties. Garlic contains allicin, which is a real and potent antibiotic compound. Honey in its raw form produces small amounts of hydrogen peroxide and maintains an environment in which bacteria struggle to survive. The people who developed these remedies did not know any of this. They knew only that it helped, sometimes, more often than nothing. That was enough to keep the knowledge alive. Eleanor made a tea of elderflower and dried nettle, the way Maud had shown her, and held the cup to Thomas's lips with the careful steadiness of someone who has performed this gesture before and understands that the warmth of the cup matters as much as whatever is inside it. He drank. It tasted of damp fields and green things, and something faintly sweet beneath the bitterness, and the warmth of it moved through him slowly, the way warmth does when the body has been cold for long enough that it has almost forgotten what warmth felt like. Outside, it had begun to rain, softly, the kind of rain that does not announce itself but simply appears as though it had always been there and you had only just noticed. The sound of it on the thatch above was low and steady and not unpleasant. Thomas closed his eyes, not because he was better. He was not better. He was not better, but because the tea was warm and his wife's hand was near and the rain was doing what rain does, which is to make the indoors feel like the only place in the world that exists. Not all of it would work, but one small thing, almost by accident, would do exactly what it was meant to do. The priest came on the second day. His name was Father Edmund. and he was neither young nor old, but somewhere in the middle distance of a face that had spent too many winters in a draughty church, conducting Mass in Latin to people who did not understand the words but felt, nonetheless, that something important was being said. He was a small man with large hands, the kind of hands that looked as though they belonged to someone considerably larger and had simply ended up here by some administrative error of nature. He carried with him a small leather satchel, a vial of holy water, and the particular expression of a man who has visited the sick so many times that he has learned to arrange his face into something that is neither alarm nor cheerfulness, but a careful, practiced calm somewhere between the two. In the 14th century, illness was not merely a physical event. It was a spiritual one. The body and the soul were not separate systems that could be treated independently. They were a single, entangled thing, and a sickness in one was understood to reflect a condition in the other. This was not ignorance exactly. It was a different map of the human being, drawn from a different set of assumptions about what a human being fundamentally was. And maps, even imperfect ones, help people navigate. They give direction to fear. They transform the shapeless terror of a man lying sick on a pallet into something that has a name and a procedure and a path forward, however uncertain. Father Edmund sat beside Thomas and spoke quietly. He spoke of God's love being present in suffering, which Thomas received with the expression of a man who has heard this before and finds it true and also insufficient, which is perhaps the most honest response that sentiment has ever received. Then the priest took the vial of holy water and pressed a small damp cross onto Thomas's forehead with his thumb, speaking in Latin that moved through the low-ceilinged room like smoke, not understood by anyone present, but felt in the chest, the way music is felt even when you cannot name the notes. Eleanor stood near the wall and watched. She believed in God the way people believe in the ground beneath their feet, not with the urgent, questioning faith of someone wrestling with doubt, but with the deep, unexamined certainty of someone who has simply never stood anywhere else. For her Father Edmund's visit and Maud's poultice were not competing treatments. They were the same treatment, addressed to different parts of the same problem. The herbs worked on the body. The prayers worked on whatever held the body together. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient alone. There were prayers specific to illness, saints to whom particular ailments were directed with the focused specificity of someone submitting a complaint to the relevant department. Saint Blaise for throat ailments, Saint Roch for plague, Saint Apollonia for the teeth. The medieval world had built an entire infrastructure of divine intercession, detailed and organized and surprisingly practical in the comfort it provided, which is itself a kind of medicine that no laboratory has ever fully explained or replicated. Father Edmund left a small piece of parchment with a written prayer on it to be placed beneath Thomas's pillow. Whether it helped, no historian can say. But that night, Thomas slept more deeply than he had in 3 days. There is a particular silence that lives inside a sick room, and it is different from every other kind of silence. It is not the silence of an empty church or a snowfield at dawn, or the moment after a door has closed. It is a furnished silence, crowded with the things no one is saying, dense with the weight of unspoken thought, so full of meaning that it sometimes feels louder than conversation. Eleanor knew this silence well. She had grown up inside it. She had learned, as all medieval women learned, that certain fears were not spoken aloud because speaking them aloud was understood to give them power, to invite them in, to set a place for them at the table where they had not yet been seated. You did not say, "What if he does not recover?" You did not say, "What will become of us if he cannot work the field in spring?" You did not say, "I have seen this before, and it did not end the way we hoped." These thoughts existed. They were as present in the room as the smell of the poultice and the sound of the rain. But they circulated in silence. passing between people through glances and the particular way a hand was laid on a shoulder, and the specific quality of a pause before someone changed the subject, and this was its own language, ancient and precise, and completely adequate to the task of carrying what words were not permitted to hold. Thomas himself said very little. This was partly the exhaustion of fever, which empties a man of everything unnecessary and leaves only the bare, slow machinery of endurance. But it was also something else. A medieval peasant's relationship with complaint was complicated by theology, by stoicism, by the practical understanding that suffering was not an aberration, but an expected feature of the landscape of a life. The way hills were a feature of a landscape, something to be moved through rather than protested. You did not argue with the terrain, you walked, and yet, in the dark, on the second night when the fire had burned down to something orange and low, and Eleanor thought he was sleeping, Thomas said something. He said it quietly, almost to the ceiling rather than to her, in the way people say the true things, sideways, into empty air, so that it could be unsaid if necessary. He said that he was frightened. Not of dying, he clarified after a moment, though perhaps of that also, but of the harvest, of the winter, of leaving her with the children, and a strip of land and a lord who would not wait for grief be E4 asking for his rent. Eleanor did not say anything for a long time. Then she moved closer to where he was lying, and she said, and this is the kind of thing that is never written in any chronicle, never preserved in any document, only carried forward invisibly in the long chain of what people have always said to one another in the dark. She said, "We are not there yet, we are still here. Go to sleep." And somehow, in the language of that particular silence, it was exactly enough. The children slept at the far end of the cottage, which is to say they slept approximately 8 feet from where their father lay ill, because the cottage had only one room and 8 feet was the distance the world had provided. There were 3 of them, 2 boys, William and Robert, aged 9 and 6, and a girl of 4 named Joan, who had her father's forehead and her mother's expression, which is to say she looked both thoughtful and slightly unconvinced at all times. They had been told their father was resting. Children in the 14th century were not shielded from illness or death in the way that later centuries would attempt. The world was too small and too honest for that kind of protective fiction. But they were told he was resting, and they accepted this with the pragmatic flexibility of children who understand that the adult world contains information they are not yet authorized to receive. Joan was the one Eleanor worried about, not because she showed any sign of illness herself, not yet, but because she had pressed herself against her father's side the previous morning before Eleanor could stop her, and had fallen asleep there with her small hand resting on his chest. And Eleanor had let her stay because some moments are more important than caution, and because the look on Thomas's face, when he had felt that small warm weight settle against him, was the most human he had. Looked in days, child mortality in medieval England was a fact so present and so ordinary that the grief around it had developed its own quiet architecture, a particular way of loving children that was fierce and complete, and also somehow braced, the way you brace when you carry something precious across uncertain ground. You held them tightly, you held them with the knowledge, never spoken, always present, that holding was something to be done now, and completely, because the world offered no guarantees about tomorrow. When a child ran a fever, the remedies were slightly different and considerably more desperate. There was a belief widespread and ancient that fever in a child could be drawn out through the skin, that if you rubbed the body with certain plants or wrapped the child in cloth that had been soaked in particular preparations, the heat would follow the substance outward and leave the child behind. Feverfew, the name itself was a hope more than a description, was crushed and pressed against the forehead. Cool water from the well, brought in and applied gently, carefully, to the wrists and the neck and the small hot face, And sometimes, in the coldest cases, something stranger, a raw onion split open and placed beneath the bed, based on the belief widespread enough to have crossed multiple countries and several centuries, that the onion would draw the sickness into itself and away from the child. It sounds almost too strange to have been real, and yet a mother in a dark cottage in 1348 is cutting an onion in half right now, in the past that still exists somewhere beneath the present, and placing it beneath her child's bed with a steadiness that is beyond argument. Because what else is there that is beyond argument? Because what else is there? And because the alternative to trying is something she has decided, quietly and completely, she will not consider. Joan slept soundly through the third night. Joan slept soundly through the third night, her hand still curved in the shape of her father's arm, reaching for something that was no longer there. It arrived the way catastrophe usually arrives in ordinary places, not with thunder, not with any signal the village might have recognized and heeded, but quietly, carried inside the unremarkable body of a wool merchant named Geoffrey, who came up the road from the south on a Tuesday morning in the kind of thin autumn light that makes everything look slightly less real than it actually is. He was heading to the market in the next town. He stopped at the village well because his horse needed water. He spoke briefly to a woman named Alice, who was drawing water for her own household, and he told her the roads from the south were slow and that there was sickness in the ports, which there often was, and Alice said she was sorry to hear it and handed him a cup of water, because this is what you did for travellers, and he drank it and thanked her and went on his way. This was the autumn of 1348. You know what is coming. Thomas and Eleanor and Alice and Geoffrey do not, and that gap between what you know and what they cannot know is perhaps the heaviest thing this story asks you to carry. There is a particular sorrow in watching a world go about its ordinary business in the last ordinary days before everything changes. The children playing in the lane, the bread baking in Alice's oven, the priest practicing his Latin in the cold church, the old Maud in her garden, talking to her plants the way she always did, as though they were slow students who needed repetition, all of it continuing, all of it in these last quiet weeks, still entirely itself. The plague that we now call the Black Death had been moving across Europe for a year before it reached Lincolnshire. It had already ended approximately 1/3 of the continent. It moved along trade routes and rivers and road, carried by fleas on rats and by the slow, ordinary movement of human commerce and human life. The very things that made a community function were the things that made transmission inevitable. In a village connected to a road, there was no preparation. There was only the road, and whatever came along, it. Thomas did not have the plague. His illness, whatever it was, some winter fever, some inflammation of the lung, was the ordinary kind of suffering that ordinary people in ordinary centuries endured and sometimes survived. But the world into which his illness had delivered him was on the edge of something that was not ordinary at all, and he did not know it, and Maud did not know it, and Eleanor did not know it, and Eleanor did not know it. The merchant Geoffrey reached the next town by midday. He sold some of his wool, he ate at a tavern. He began to feel, sometime in the late afternoon, a strange and unfamiliar heaviness in his limbs, and the cart came back down the road 3 days later, riderless, moving slowly, stopping occasionally to graze the verge, with no particular awareness that anything had changed. Here is what history keeps, and here is what it loses. It keeps the names of kings and the dates of battles and the terms of treaties signed by men in rooms that were warm, while the fields outside them were not. It keeps the architecture, the cathedrals, the castles, the great houses of the great families, the stone things that stone makes possible. It keeps the chronicles written by monks in monasteries who had the twin luxuries of literacy and time, and who wrote down what seemed to them important, which was mostly the behavior of powerful men and the movements of armies, and the judgments of God upon the sinful. What it loses is almost everything else. The name of the herbalist in the village, the specific recipe she pressed into a frightened woman's hands on a cold morning, the P, articular poultice, the particular prayer, the way a mother held a cup of elderflower tea to a sick man's lips in the specific dark of a specific winter that has now been gone for 700 years, and yet some of it survived, not as record, not as document, but as practice, carried forward in the bodies and habits and accumulated knowledge of ordinary people who kept doing what their mothers had taught them, who kept the dried herbs hanging from the rafter and the honey in the jar, and the knowledge of which plant grew where in the hedgerow and what it was good for. Folk medicine did not disappear when the Renaissance arrived, or when the printing press was invented, or when the first proper medical schools began to formalize what had previously been informal. It moved alongside formal medicine, sometimes below it, sometimes beside it, sometimes ignored, and sometimes quietly indispensable, surviving in the way that truly useful things survive, by continuing to be needed. And some of those remedies, the ones mixed by firelight in cottages that left no trace, by women whose names are entirely gone, are being studied now. In laboratories made of glass and light and expensive equipment, researchers are looking at yarrow and finding antimicrobial properties. They are looking at honey and finding antibacterial activity. They are looking at garlic and finding compounds that modern pharmaceuticals have spent decades trying to synthesize. They are looking, with sophisticated instruments, at what a woman named Maud already knew in her approximate and earthbound way in a garden in Lincolnshire in 1348. Thomas recovered. This is not certain as a historical fact. Thomas is not a historical figure, and his recovery belongs to this story rather than to any archive. But recovery was possible. People did recover. The body given warmth and rest and something warm to drink. Anne, DA hand nearby in the dark, has an extraordinary and persistent will toward survival. It does not always succeed, but it tries always with a stubbornness that is one of the most moving things about it. Eleanor kept the dried yarrow in a bundle above the door for the rest of her life. She did not know the science of it. She knew only that it had been there when she needed it, and that this seemed like sufficient reason to keep it. Some knowledge does not need to understand itself in order to be true. On the 5th night, the fever broke. It did not break dramatically. This is not that kind of story, and illness in the real world, then as now, does not take its cues from drama. It broke the way the fever always breaks, which is quietly in the night, while everyone is asleep and no one is watching, the body making its private peace with whatever it has been, fighting and beginning, slowly, tentatively, to return to itself. Thomas woke sometime before dawn in a sweat that was different from the fever sweat. Cleaner, somehow, the kind that feels like something leaving rather than something pressing in. And he lay in the dark and listened to the cottage breathe around him, and knew without being able to say exactly how he knew that the worst of it was past. Eleanor was already awake. She had not slept properly in 5 days, not because she kept vigil in any formal sense, but because the part of her that monitored the sound of her husband's breathing had simply refused to fully surrender to sleep, maintaining a thin, persistent thread of attention through every night that she would not remember as wakefulness but would feel in her bones for weeks afterward. She pressed her hand to his forehead. The heat was gone. In its place was the ordinary, unremarkable warmth of a living person, and she stayed there for a long moment with her hand against his face as though she needed to be certain, as though certainty was a thing that required time to settle. She did not cry. She was not that kind of woman, or perhaps this was not the kind of moment she cried at. She had calibrated her emotions across a hard life to match hard circumstances, saving what was soft for the moments that deserved it most. She simply sat beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe, and the sound of it was the best sound in the world, in the way that ordinary things become extraordinary only when you have spent time imagining their absence. She got up once, in the very early morning before the light had fully decided what it was going to do with the day. She went to the rafter where the dried herbs still hung, the yarrow, the something else, the grey-green bundles that smelled of Maud's garden and all the unnamed centuries before it. She touched them once, lightly, with 2 fingers, the way you touch something you are grateful for, without quite knowing how to say so. Then she let her hand fall and went back to where Thomas was lying and sat down beside him again. In the lane outside, someone's goat was making its morning complaint. Somewhere further away, a cock was crowing, late or perhaps simply unhurried, as though this morning was not especially different from any other morning, which, in the lane's experience, it was not. The village was waking up. The world was proceeding, and inside this small warm room, a woman sat beside a man who was going to live in a century that asked so much of ordinary people and gave them so little. And outside, the pale grey light of an early English morning was doing what light has always done, arriving without drama, without announcement, filling the spaces between things so gently that you only notice it when it is already everywhere. This is what survived. Not the remedies exactly, though some of those survived too. Not the prayers, though some of those were written down. But what survived was this, the hand on the forehead in the dark, the cup held carefully to the lips, the woman who did not sleep for 5 nights because some part of her simply would not allow it, the care that cost the carer something real, offered anyway, without ceremony, because the alternative was not something she would consider. 700 years is a very long time, and yet here it is, still warm,